Hello, everybody. Some of you may not have heard from me yet. I'm Mr. Powell, and I am been kind of assigned as we're breaking up this work among all of our social studies teachers a little bit on the Enlightenment. And so, for us, the learning objectives, if you follow the reading in uh, chapter 12, lesson 3, we're not going to really hit everything in lesson 3. And so one of the things that is the point of this screencast and the notes that I have provided with that, these are basically what we hope to learn and accomplish from lesson 3. And it's, of course, to explain how the Enlightenment ideas spread. That's going to be the first thing we talk about. That shouldn't be actually really hard. Think of the technology of the time of how do ideas spread. We're also going to talk about the immediate impact of the Enlightenment to the generally the people who were living and breathing at the time of the Enlightenment, or maybe I'll stretch a little bit to just afterwards. Okay, and then finally, and most importantly, your book does a very good job of this at the end of lesson 3 of determining the long-term impact or the legacy of the Enlightenment. So let's start with the first order of business. The first objective, right, is how did the Enlightenment spread? Okay, and this is not rocket science. You can see the Enlightenment's going to spread because Enlightenment philosophers wrote their ideas down, and so because of writing, the Enlightenment's going to spread. We'll talk about this in a second. One of the most important tools for the spreading of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution is going to be Diderot's encyclopedia. We're also going to have a growing literate middle class in Europe. And I'll have more to say on that in a second. And of course, the Enlightenment is going to spread by word of mouth as people gather and talk about that. In particular, in your reading, you see these ideas of salons, okay? And really, realistically, what are they? They're parties in France. So let's talk about the first one, Diderot's encyclopedia. Denis Diderot is French, and he begins compiling what we think about Wikipedia and what Wikipedia is. It's an online encyclopedia. What Diderot is going to do is try to compile articles and writings about as many different subjects as possible. And he wrote some of the articles. He's also going to edit and compile a lot of articles written by other people and compile them into a series of books that we're calling the encyclopedia, in our modern encyclopedia. So you had many leading scholars of science and the Enlightenment. So, for example, Voltaire wrote, and his writings are also going to be used in the encyclopedia. We're also going to see that Diderot's encyclopedia, there's going to be some backlash to it. Okay, it is going to anger the Catholic Church and the French government, and we'll talk about really kind of that when we look at what's the immediate impact of the Enlightenment. And again, the really important thing is, why does the Enlightenment spread? It spreads through writing a lot. But what you do have is a growing middle class, especially in Western Europe, also in France. And many of these middle class can read. And they're going to be heavily influenced by the ideas of the Enlightenment. Many of our founding fathers are going to read these articles and have a copy of those articles through Diderot's encyclopedia. And it's going to have a big influence. The other thing that we said is that parties in France actually helped to spread ideas of the Enlightenment. And I'm assuming these are probably not like the parties you have attended, but fairly rich people, mostly rich women, hosted these parties in France, and they do what people do at parties. They eat, they probably had some wine, but they also hosted Enlightenment thinkers. They also hosted scientists to actually speak at these parties. And so what you do have is you have a bunch of mostly rich people gathering and hearing and listening to these scientific ideas and the ideas of the Enlightenment. And so it's going to spread by word of mouth. It is also these rich people, in particularly a rich sponsor, that is going to help finance and pay for Diderot to publish his encyclopedia. And kind of as a last comment on this, one of the things that struck me about the Enlightenment is revolutionary ideas, in particular about equality and women's rights. But most of the Enlightenment philosophers did not believe in equality for women. And so this was something not majorly talked about, but women actually play a really important role, in particular in reading and believing in these ideas and helping to spread the revolution, these revolutionary ideas. And women are going to play an incredible role, especially when it comes to the French Revolution. And so that is, ladies and gentlemen, really how the Enlightenment ideas themselves spread. We're next going to kind of move on to what I would call the immediate impact or the immediate results of the Enlightenment. You can see here, I'm going to talk mostly about these first two. Governments and churches reacted negatively. Okay, the enlightened despots are going to make some reforms. We'll have some brief things to say on that, but really, you could include this as a long-term result or also kind of an immediate result. One of the major implications of the ideas of the Enlightenment is they are going to lead to revolutions. So when you look at the first half of a year of study, we're calling this the age of revolution. You have the scientific revolution and Enlightenment, the American Revolution, the French Revolution. There are Latin American revolutions, the Industrial Revolution, the Russian Revolution. And many of those revolutions are going to have their roots right here in the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. Let's first talk about the results of the Enlightenment when it comes to the church and governments of the time. Diderot's encyclopedia and Enlightenment ideas were a threat to old traditions. Okay, and so the generic answer by government, in particularly the French government and the Catholic Church, was that the old order has been established by God. Okay, and we're going to understand a lot more about the old order of things when we talk about the French Revolution. But let me just briefly say is this idea that belief that there are social classes. You have nobles who are born with better blood than other people. Okay, and then you have commoners, and then you have a king, and that king has been placed there by God. And so the belief and Enlightenment philosophers argued in many ways against that old order. The counter argument by government and by the church was that God created the old order. And if you're arguing with the old order, in fact, you're arguing with God himself. And so they use that premise to their most common weapon was censorship. They banned Diderot's encyclopedia. You read earlier in lesson 2 how Voltaire was exiled to England from France because he had offended the Catholic clergy. And so this was the common reaction by the traditions in place at the time of the Enlightenment. Of course, you see the writers, they fought back against this. And again, the best example of that fighting back was Voltaire. Voltaire disguised or began disguising a lot of his criticisms of the Catholic Church and criticism of the French nobility in works of fiction. And then, of course, people just broke the law. They read the books or obtained copies of books anyway, despite the fact that they were censored. Another immediate impact of the Enlightenment is a little tricky to talk about. There's a whole long section in your reading that I'm trying to condense down really into one slide right here. And so to not overload you with names and of kings and things of this nature, we're going to talk about this kind of in a generic type of form. The term enlightened despot really is an oxymoron. Okay, a despot is somebody who rules with absolute power. But to be enlightened means that, and you're believing in some of the ideas and reforms of the Enlightenment, the two don't really go hand in hand. And so, for practical purposes, really, what did enlightened despots do? Number one, there was some who shifted some of their thinking on this belief that, the old belief of many monarchs was that I'm the king or I'm the queen, and the people really, God placed me here, and the people really kind of exist and to pledge their loyalty to me. When some monarchs will take the reverse view of, okay, I'm king and God has placed me here as king, and he's done so as to be the first servant of the people. And so it did shift some attitudes in how kings were now the true representative of the people, and they were there to serve the people. There are also some important reforms that were passed by despot. Um, they tried to hold on to all of their power. They were very reluctant at trying to give up power, for example, to an elected group of people, but they will make some important reforms. And realistically, I think some of the most important reforms they were made were the influence of Cesare Beccaria in criminal justice reforms. So there will be reforms, but what they won't do is give up their power. So finally, the last thing on our objective is really the big one, the legacy, the long-term impact in changing ideas about society because of the Enlightenment. And those are well spelled out in your reading, so I'm going to be brief here. But we see these three categories here. The first is a belief in progress, right? You have new scientific discoveries that were made, and the belief now is that science, in that process of discovering scientific truth, can also be used now to improve society and improve social problems. I like to go back to Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon was a scientist who conducted experiments, but he was particularly interested in trying to experiment and experience things that would actually help everyday people in society. And so many of the reformers of the Enlightenment, while they only wrote their ideas, right, many of the ideas that they talked about were the equality of all people, not necessarily among races, but mostly among social classes. So unfortunately, partly the idea of races are, science is going to kind of grab a hold of that. And some people are going to take the idea that the different races are not necessarily equal. But at the very least, reformers, the one thing that many of the Enlightenment reformers did agree upon, or most of them anyway, is that there was equality among the social classes, most especially of, let's not face it, mostly Europe. Reformers also are going to write and then heavily influence about this idea of ending the slave trade practice. And they also generally agreed upon this idea of universal human rights, which is going to have a big impact in the coming revolutions that were influenced by Enlightenment writers. There's also a more secular outlook. Previously, you look at the early Middle Ages, and all writing and scholarship tended to be about theology. And oftentimes this view of why should we seek to improve our life here? What is most important is preparing your soul for the afterlife. And so don't worry about improving your life here. The next life is going to be better. Well, the Enlightenment and scientific revolution kind of changed that attitude and belief. And their belief is that, not everything has to be, not all scholarship is scholarship of theology or the Bible. We can study other things. And oftentimes, this caused some to question their religious beliefs, and they attacked religion as superstition. There's a certain element of the Enlightenment philosophers who are atheists, or others, as you see below there, there's this also growth of a different non-Christianity, but still a belief in God, the growth of deism. And this caused others to think about God kind of like how Newton described it, is that God is the creator of all of these natural laws, and he makes the universe kind of like you would make a clock. And then God kind of sits on the sideline and watches that clock operate by those natural laws. The other thing that goes along with this more secular outlook is that Enlightenment philosophers preached and argued for religious toleration. And this does have a long term impact. And finally, you have the Enlightenment really believed in individual rights and the importance of the individual. When you talk about many, not all, but many of the Enlightenment views on government were that individuals decided to form government to promote the common good. And so the importance of the individual and the importance of individual rights were highly valued. And also, and we're not going to spend much time on this because this is going to be something that comes up when we talk about the Industrial Revolution, is Adam Smith's philosophy on economics. And he believed and wrote one of the most influential books called The Wealth of Nations, and where he described the idea that individual self-interest, especially when it comes to economic decisions, like where should I work? If I'm going to start a business, it's individually up to me to decide, hey, I want to start this business. And he is going to argue that individual self-interest can be good for all without government interference. And so when we look at the long-term impact, the long-term impact is going to sort of shape and change how we sort of look at and view society. So hopefully this has been helpful for you. Again, make sure you do your reading and be prepared to discuss this in class at some time. Thank you.